It's December. You're counting down the days to Christmas. You're pretty sure your parents are going to get you that Nerf gun you'll play with 3 whole times, and all is right in the world. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Then your parents tell you that because they're going to be busy, you'll be staying with great aunt Marjorie for a few days. She doesn't have Wi-Fi, she still listens to the radio in the living room, and when the TV is turned on, she turns it to Sky News and holds the remote with an iron grip. And each day, she decides to take you to a different place of infinite boredom, like the garden centre, or BHS, or the garden centre, or God forbid, the garden centre. And the chariot of choice that carries you to these purgatories of endless grey is a Rover 75. An image along these lines is what most people associate with the now-dead longboat. Either that or someone twatted their MG-ZR into their car and sped off never to be seen again. Rover is about as dead as a central London pub at 4:30 PM. Jaguar Land Rover still holds the rights, but they'll never bring it back, because there's simply no demand. Which is odd when you think about it. Saab went bust in recent memory too, and ever since there's been an outpouring of respect for the late Swede, but for Rover? Nothing. Mostly because, as I just covered, they have the brand image of a central London pub at 4:30 PM. Failed launch after failed launch, new owner after new owner, and warranty claims piling up at the door left Rover with a reputation for building shoddy OAP mobiles.
I've wet myself again!
Rover could never seem to catch a break, despite the often fantastic cars it produced. Many will point to its ownership by the one we don't talk about. We do not speak its name, for its wrongs can never be righted, and its best they are forgotten. And call it a day. But what most don't know is that Rover's ensnarement by that thing had far more repercussions than just stunting its future attempts to succeed, like dropping a baby on its head. Because in this case, the baby is more like an honor roll student who's doing really well in every subject and just got a scholarship to a good school, and I feel like this simile went a bit too far. Anyway, the point is, in the mid to late 60s, Rover was the crown jewel of the British car industry. Government officials were all driven around in Rovers, and while the Queen, Rip Bozo, was chauffeured in a roller, when she was driving, she drove a Rover. But unlike Jaguar, Rover weren't content with achieving success and then sticking with the formula. Underneath the wooden leather, Rover was an ambitious, revolutionary company that wanted to go toe-to-toe internationally with the big daddy, Mercedes. The one luxury marque that prior to the age of global commerce had managed to become an internationally recognized prestige symbol. Rover was developing successors to its then current lineup explicitly as Mercedes killers. And in one of the chief engineer's own words, "We're leaving the antique motorcars to Jaguar." Fighting talk, and a stark contrast to the ideas of retirement home visits that the name Rover now conjures. So how did we go from flipping Jaguar the finger to this? Well, let's find out. In this video. The one you're watching now. It's what the video's about. I've written a whole script. To answer the question of what happened to Rover, we first have to do what every good video essay needs to do. Add runtime padding, helpful and enlightening context. The start of the 1968 model year was arguably Rover's peak. Although they only produced 2 models, the P5 and P6 were desirable cars, mainly because they could both be equipped with the glorious Rover V8. An all-aluminium design of Buick descent, GM had abandoned it because they hadn't properly taken into account that aluminium doesn't act like cast iron. Oh, fuck's sake, GM, never change. Rover bought the rights for a bargain, quickly reworking it into a compact, powerful, reliable workhorse that would go on to power everything from Rover's luxury offerings to Land and Range Rovers, hot MGs, TVRs, Morgans, vans, the list really is endless. I could do a whole video on the Rover V8, but I'm busy making this one, so instead, I'm announcing a petition to get Driving for Answers to do an iconic engines video on it. In 1968 it came exclusively in 3.5 litre guise. That year it became available in the P6, a compact executive saloon that won the very first European Car of the Year award, thanks to aluminium body panels and fancy de Dion tube suspension. Sorry, hang on.
De Dion tube.
The previous year it had rejuvenated the aging but venerable P5, the working man's Rolls-Royce, whose newfound grunt would keep it the British government's car of choice until the early 1980s, almost 10 years after it would finish production.
It's a shame that the IRA...
Rover were the favourite child, but even before the Rover V8 became available in the P5, they knew that however successful the rebirth was, at the end of the day the P5 was by then a near 10-year-old car. Likewise, the P6, while far more modern, was going to need replacing sooner rather than later to keep the momentum going. To keep costs down, a single model would succeed both cars, but the success of the P5 and P6 even by 1965, and the consolidation of the development budget into a single car, enabled the engineers at Rover to shoot for the sky. No, I'm not doing another Spamton thing. Rover began their development by testing new suspension ideas. The praise that they'd earned for the complex de Dion tube suspension of the P6 persuaded the dev team to build something truly world-beating, so they decided their starting point would be what was already the best in the world. The Citroën DS had debuted a decade previously, but its ingenious hydropneumatic suspension provided such a supple ride that Rolls-Royce, makers of the best automobiles the world had to offer, opted to license the Citroën suspension rather than designing their own. 11 years later, it was still industry-leading, but with one key flaw. The soft ride dealt with bumps beautifully, but show at a corner and the DS leaned over like me looking funny at the half-eaten pork pie and open pack of cheese in the fridge at 3:43 AM. Also, can we just take a minute to watch one of these weird-ass Citroën ads? They're so disconcerting. I'm expecting that fucking annoying lobster meme to happen any second. Yeah, I had you for a moment there, didn't I? Luckily, Rover had already bought a DS as a benchmark car when developing the P6. The Citroën was brought out of storage, immediately gutted of its suspension, which was then fitted to a P6 test mule. This began a series of experiments known as the P7s, hence the successor project to the P5 and P6 became known as the P8. Rover quickly discovered that one of the keys to the Citroën's magic carpet ride was a system that pumped extra fluid to the rear suspension when the front suspension was compressed, thus keeping the car level. It was at this point that they thought, well, as well as doing it front to back, why don't we do it side to side? Citroën and Rolls-Royce hadn't done this, as lateral compressions in corners often happen a lot more quickly, and the hydraulic fluid couldn't be pumped fast enough. But by the mid-60s, they had the technology.
We have the capability to make the world's first
laterally acting hydropneumatic suspension system.
Test footage of a P7 fitted with this system speaks for itself. It wouldn't be until the fully active computer-controlled systems of the 90s and 2000s that cars would deal with roll this well. It was decided that the P8 would include this system as an optional extra, with a de Dion tube rear suspension retained from the P6 and new double wishbones at the front. The engine choices were a no-brainer. The 2-litre straight 4 from the P6 and the newly acquired 3.5-litre V8. During this time, sketches were made as to what the new car would look like. Immediately, a squared-off, muscular shape was adopted, in tune with the heavy metal Americana of Detroit, although some sketches include design cues from the then-in-development Range Rover, which I prefer. This school of styling was in vogue in the 60s, even in Europe, but rather than coming off as a knockoff attempt to jump on the bandwagon, the P8's design successfully stands on its own, predicting where the muscular design language would go in the 70s, and incorporating it into an overall well-proportioned and forward-looking package, if a little slap-sided. Overall, it looks exactly like something the bad guys would drive in any number of British crime thrillers like The Saint, The Professionals, or The Sweeney. Despite the handsome looks of the saloon though, it's this concept for an estate that steals it for me. It would never have made it to production due to the massive expense that curved glass hatch would have been to make. but it's simply stunning. To anyone who's seen the interior of a Rover SD1, the sketches for the inside of the P8 will look very familiar. Gone is the stuffy wood trim, and in is space-age soft-touch plastic, although at least leather seats have yet to be abandoned. All the more impressive considering the P8 was set to launch 5 years ahead of the eventual outing of the SD1. One weird thing to note is that Quartic steering wheel that would later be seen and roundly mocked on the Austin Allegro.
No! We don't talk about it!
All while these brainstorming sessions for the P8 were going on, another group of engineers at Rover were staring at the beautiful, compact, powerful new V8 the company had just bought, and realised its excellent power-to-weight ratio would make it the perfect fit in a potential Mercedes SL rival. As luck would have it, the year Rover bought the rights to the V8, they also bought the bankrupt luxury GT manufacturer Alvis, which gave them the perfect workshop to develop and build the new car, and a prestigious badge to put on the bonnet. But by the mid-60s, big front-engined rear-drive GTs were yesterday's news. They'd been done before and would be again in the future. Rover wanted to be a shooting star, so they'd have to break the mold. But even the light and compact Rover V8 was too big and bulky to mount behind the rear axle like a Porsche would, so what could Rover do? Spen King, the man behind the Range Rover and P6, decided the car should be mid-engined. Although mid-engine sports cars are a dime a dozen these days, in 1965 the layout was relegated to the racetrack, and the Lamborghini Miura, the car that proved that mid-engines could work just as well in road-going supercars as they could on the circuit, hadn't even launched yet. So to decide that Rover's answer to the luxury sports coupes of the 60s would use this layout was a bolder move than the one I did into your mother last night. A test mule, the P6BS, was quickly knocked together to test the idea. While certainly no looker, the BS was a favourite among test drivers, also like your mother, and sketches for the production car, which was known internally as the P9, showed it adopting a very handsome shape. This wasn't just a concept either. Rover put a provisional price on it of $5,000, which for its intended 1973 launch was cheaper than a Corvette. To complete the provisional new Alvis range, a coupe version of the P6 was developed. Officially called the Alvis GTS, but affectionately nicknamed Gladys by the dev team, it was a very elegant car itself. But it was in the year of 1967 that Rover was no longer its own master. A new name would become its overlord and would dictate its destiny. And that name was Leyland Motor Corporation. Yes, this is actually a different Leyland before that wretched thing formed. At the time, LMC was just Leyland Trucks and the highly successful Triumph. This was actually fantastic news for Rover, as Leyland were flush with cash and more than happy to spend it. Leyland management took one look at the P8 and said, "It's fantastic, we love it, there's just one small problem. We want it to be even bigger." The overall dimensions of the car were increased, providing better boot and interior space, but the greater bulk required more power. The P6's 4 was dropped, leaving the Rover 3.5 V8 as the entry-level option, with expansions up to 4 and 4.4 litres being approved. This would have made the P8 one of the most powerful European executive saloons. However, the increase in scope of the project meant that the P8 could now only act as a successor to the larger P5, meaning a direct replacement for the P6 had to be developed. Sketches by David Bache, who also helped design the P6, showed a move to a much more wedge-like design for what would become known as the P10, successfully anticipating the 70s obsession with everything that looked like a slice of cheese. And looking a bit more than a lot like the SD1 that would somehow manage to escape into reality years later. Mechanically, they would have been similar too. The 3.5 Rover V8 was to be the P10's range topper, but more interesting than that was to be the car's 4-cylinder option. The 2-litre from the P6 was to be entirely reworked, the block bored out to 2.2 litres, and a new twin-cam aluminium head fitted, complete with Bosch fuel injection. All this combined allowed it to kick out 150 on the testbed, nothing short of boundary-pushing performance by 70s standards. Better still, similar fuel injection was approved for all variations of the V8, with 250 horsepower easily possible from the 4.4. Lastly, there are rumours, the paper trail is all but non-existent, so take this with a pinch of salt, that once the P10 was ready for the road, the ex-Buick Rover V8 would be dropped in favour of a new V8 created by joining two of the twin cam 4s together to create a 4.4 litre dual overhead cam 32 valve fuel injected V8, producing in the realms of 300 horsepower, turning the P8 into one of the world's first true super saloons. All these pieces were in place by 1968. The Range Rover's unveiling was 2 years away, with the Alvis GTS launching around the same time, the P8 midway through the following year, then the P9 and P10 in 1973, all while the shot in the arm that was the Rover V8 would keep the P5 and P6 selling well until their replacements were ready. By 73, Rover would be in possession of one of the world's most desirable model ranges, the Range Rover inventing the concept of the luxury SUV, the P8 a technologically advanced bruiser, a forward-looking slice of executive future armor in the form of the P10, and the P9 a radical sports tourer. Rover was ready to go global, in the same way the British Empire had years before. I drink brandy like flat water pours down a mine shaft. But then, it came along. What cruel god would willingly let such a calamity wreak its havoc? How could such a fell creature even enter our mortal plane from the depths of the world beyond nightmares from which it surely emerged? No. It's better not to question it. Its wrongs can never be righted, and it's best they are forgotten. Its wrongs can never be righted, and it's best they are forgotten. And it's best they are its wrongs can never be righted, and it's best they are forgotten. Its wrongs can never be righted, and it's best they are forgotten. That they are forgotten. Its wrongs can never be righted, and it's best they are forgotten. No! The beast will never die as long as it lives in our minds. We must tackle it head on. We must read the cursed tomes and talk about British Leyland. Formed from the unholy union of Leyland and BMC, it was intended to be a British General Motors, a super manufacturer, to take on the world. Instead, two things happened. Firstly, all the British car companies that had once been competing with each other were now one company that competed with itself. BL's existence was naught but a civil war for many years. Secondly, the financially stable Leyland was saddled with the financial black hole that was BMC, the intention being that Leyland would somehow save both. In reality, it doomed both of them to cost and corner cutting everything they produced, leading to the woeful reputation that dogged the British car industry to its final days. These factors combined led to one of the most painful, drawn-out deaths of any company in existence, with the effects of the merger as traceable causes of Rover's ultimate demise in 2005. Suffice to say, from the outset, it wasn't looking good. With BMC's broadcast now in the picture, Rover's budget came under scrutiny more intense than that of a student desperately trying to get an essay past the minimum word count. Worse still, the Leyland BMC marriage meant rival Jaguar was now Rover's stepbrother, which meant it had to compete for funding. No matter, the evident superiority of Rover's projects would surely win the respect of the new board, right? Wrong. Jaguar was still considered, perhaps rightfully so, the more prestigious name of the two. Anything with a Jaguar badge was going to sell well and be accepted. Rover had to fight for it, which meant they had to convince the new higher-ups. Who even are the new higher-ups anyway? Some old faces from Leyland, a few new ones from BMC. Sir William Lyons, co-founder of Jaguar. Oh fuck. Sir William Lyons founded Swallow Sidecars, the company that would become Jaguar, the second it was legal for him to do so on his 21st birthday, and had been the enigmatic face of the company ever since. Such was his force of personality, he was knighted in 1956 for Jaguar's service to the motor industry. The man lived and breathed Jaguar. His nickname was Mr. Jaguar. It therefore comes as no surprise that he was as subtle as a pipe bomb about his only purpose on BL's board being the protection of Jaguar's interests and Jaguar's alone, which meant Drive 2011ing any potential competition from within the company. And with no one on the board directly repping Rover, Lyons had the longboat directly in his sights. Immediately, the two Alvises, the GTS and P9, were labelled as potential Jaguar E-Type rivals, and Lyons had them CIA'd on the spot, killing off Alvis for good. The P10 was safe for now, as it was small enough that it didn't directly compete with Jaguar, but Lyons did make a fuss about the P8, semi-correctly pointing out it would encroach on the XJ's market. However, this was met with more resistance from the rest of the board. By that point, the P8 project was too far in development to cancel on a whim, and Lyons would need a better excuse to scrap it entirely. In the meantime, Rover was at least able to get the highly anticipated Range Rover to market, and the P10 began to take shape. If the P8 stayed on track and got to production without a hitch, Rover still had a good chance of pulling off its big plan. It's 1971. The final shape of the P8 has been decided, the factories are being retooled for P8 production, and none of its advanced features have been walked back. A handful of staff have taken some pre-production cars to Mira for crash testing. Once the tests were concluded, production could begin immediately. The car accelerates to 30 for a standard front collision test, and it was a complete and unexpected disaster. Rather than the engine bay folding on impact, it was the front passenger compartment which had done so. The prototype had completely failed its crash testing. Even in the early 70s, you couldn't send a car to market that would turn its inner occupants into bolognese in the event of a crash. Extra steel was welded to the frame of the second prototype, but results, while better, weren't good enough. It had taken 3 years and had gotten perilously close to the launch of the P8, but the extra months and costs needed to alter the frame gave Lyons the excuse he needed to convince the BL board to scrap the P8. Even in the short time between the initial crash tests and the project being officially cancelled, another prototype was tested and performed far better. With even just a few more weeks, the car would have been production ready. But the board had made their choice. 6 years of carefully considered development and revolutionary technology, all for nothing. So last minute was this decision that it made the front page of the Times, before the workers at the Rover factory had even heard about it. They rioted and protested outside the factory to no avail, as would become a trend at BL. 2 years later, the P10 would make it to the same stage and even perform admirably, but was once again cancelled for seemingly little reason. Perhaps because the P6 was still selling reasonably well, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The advanced twin-cam 2.2 was dropped in favour of cheaper developments of Triumph 6, design elements from the P8's interior were incorporated, and the P10 re-emerged as the SD1 3 years later. And that was that. The only element of Rover's 1968 plans that made it to the road unchanged was the Range Rover. Other hints can be found here and there. The tooling used to bore out Rover's straight 4 were used to make a 2.2 version of the P6, although without twin cams or fuel injection. And Leyland Australia produced a 4.4 version of the Rover V8 for the ill-fated Leyland P76, the same way the P8's dev team had. Both the Alvis GTS prototype and P6BS test mule survived entirely intact, with both being intermittently put on display to this day, while the sole remaining P8 prototype is a gutted hulk, last seen a decade ago when its owners, British Motor Heritage, briefly left it outside for transiting. With that, Rover was doomed to follow the long, tragic path to its death we see written in its Wikipedia page. We'll never know what would have happened if BL never formed and Rover's ambitious dreams were allowed to progress. Maybe it would have finally busted Rover into the US market and they'd still be a reputable premium manufacturer, contending with BMW, Mercedes and Audi. Spen King had his doubts about the P8 though, saying it was trying to be impressive but not good, so maybe it would have been a colossal failure. Maybe the early 70s oil crisis would have put the large thirsty P8 to bed. Regardless how the plans would have panned out, I'd hazard a guess that even if they still wouldn't be around today, Rover would probably be remembered a little more fondly had they been allowed to chase their dream. Hello, welcome to the little unscripted corner of the video. I would just like to start off by saying that if you are indeed still watching and or listening, thank you so much. These videos basically serve as fully realized visions of what would otherwise be deranged ramblings to my friends, and so, you know, I think this is probably a healthier outlet for such things. Much like the end of the previous video, I'm just going to be covering some little things that are worthy of note or things that are of interest that I wasn't able to fit into the rest of the video, and at the end I'll be doing some special thanks for people who helped me make the video. So I tried to make the point in the video that Rover was actually quite a technically advanced company, and one thing that's definitely part of that but that I wasn't able to talk about was the fact that Rover experimented a lot with gas turbines. Yeah, it wasn't just Chrysler that was doing that in the 50s and 60s. Experiments first started with the Jet 1, which I think first started running in 1950, which was... that's utterly bonkers. First test runs, it was able to max out at 88 miles an hour, insert Back to the Future joke here, but then in 1952, in test runs in Belgium, it was able to do 150, which, I'm sorry, that's just utterly fucking insane. After this, the Jet name of the turbine prototypes was dropped in favor of just T number, so we then move on to the T2. The T2 is sort of lost to time. There's only one picture I can find of it, and it just looks like a normal P4. But then there's the T3. The T3 is this small little coupe with an almost Italian look to it, you know, kind of looks like an Auto Bianchi or one of those Fiat coupes from the time. But it has this mid-mounted gas turbine, which is, you know, just crazy. And then finally there's the T4, which mounted the gas turbine in the front and was very clearly based on the P6. This is where the sort of road-going experiments for gas turbines stop. Rover had developed the concept a lot, but realized that they wouldn't be able to produce it economically on a mass scale. But they decided to show how far they had gone with the concept. They teamed up with BRM to make a Le Mans car powered by gas turbines, one of only 2 cars that has ever raced at Le Mans that was powered by a gas turbine. The Rover BRM, as it was aptly called, was raced for 3 years straight, 63 through to 65 in the 2-litre class, and in 63 and 65 it managed to place 8th and 10th respectively overall, not just in the 2-litre class. So, you know, this is some pretty capable stuff they're showing here. Next, I wanted to cover any confusion there may be over the P9, it being mid-engined. There are probably a lot of people who would want to refer to it as a supercar, but it was intended to fully and comfortably seat 4 people, and therefore, in my mind, that makes it a GT, meant to compete with, you know, your Jaguar E-Types, your Aston Martins, your, you know, Mercedes SLs, you know, all these grand touring cars that are meant to be stylish and svelte and sporty, but also transport people in comfort. There's also one final prototype that I decided not to talk about in the main bulk of the video because it was never intended for production, unfortunately, but I can talk about here, and that is the Rover P6 2000 TCZ. Essentially, it was a 2-litre version of the P6, rebodied by Zagato, of all people, to be this sort of very avant-garde coupe. And then there's the case of the twin-cam V8 for the P8. The paper trail, as I mentioned, is almost non-existent, and by that I mean there is 1, maybe 2 slight things. Oh, yes! Sorry, just found out that my manager cancelled my shift today. Hell yeah! So yeah, there's like 1, maybe 2 things that point towards this V8 maybe existing. The first is that when Rover were designing the second generation Range Rover, the P38 gen, there was some talk as to whether they would use a BMW twin cam V8 or their own in-house twin cam V8. No one knows what this in-house twin cam V8 is. They were not producing it at the time, so no one knows what it is. There are two possible solutions. The first is that they were planning on conjoining, I think, two T-Series straight fours. I think that's a straight four they were making at the time. Or possibly they were planning on reviving a possible dual overhead cam V8 that they were designing for the P8. The second piece of evidence I think that possibly points towards the dual overhead cam V8 for the P8 being real was that the straight 4 that was used in the P6 that was turned into the twin cam fuel injected straight 4 intended for the P10 was a slant 4, slanted at roughly 45 degrees, which would make it very easy to turn into a traditional 90-degree V8. That's the same thing Triumph did. It's the reason why the Triumph straight 4 was a slant 4, so that they could more easily design it into a V8, which they then did. All this being said, it is mostly rampant speculation, but look, a man can but hope, okay? Finally, is just like a final piece of desperate hope that I have personally. If you go on the British Motor Museum's website and look at their online collection section, they still have an entry for the P8. They don't have a picture for it, it says coming soon, but it's still there. That still means they plan on doing something with it. You know? They haven't completely put it to bed yet. I so desperately want them to restore it properly. That would be incredible. Finally, onto the special thanks. I would like to thank my friends Sai and Pine for being unwitting test dummies for parts of this video. A special thanks to my friend Steve for recording the absurd car noises that I used for that little bit with the MG at the beginning.
Explosions. Ah, there we go, I did it.
And I would like to give an extra special thanks to Harv for putting together that absolutely outstanding analog horror sequence featuring British Leyland for me. I have nothing even approaching the kind of knowledge and talent to make something like that, and so I just on a whim, as a joke, I asked him for a joke to be funny for him to make it, and he did it. Thank you so much. So with that, I'm pretty sure that covers everything. It is way too early in the AM to be recording this. If you're still watching now even, I thank you even more. And yeah, this is the second one of these I've made, so I guess that means I'm actually, like, trying to do this now, which is crazy in its own right. I guess I'll see you for the next one. That feels really weird to say, but yeah, bye-bye.